So, welcome back, Ottolinas. Today we talk once again about women. Usually in Europe, when we think about feminism, we think about the mainstream feminism, whose main goal is to break the glass ceiling. That is, to allow every woman to become a CEO. However, as Angela Davis pointed out many times, if your main problem is to break the glass ceiling, it means that you're high enough to touch the ceiling. So this is not 90% feminism. This is a white bourgeois feminism that doesn't consider the class nor either the race. So today we want to go back to a time and a place where feminism was for every woman. So we are here with Florentine from If DDR, who is the author of a beautiful notebook that was just published on Tricontinental. This is a notebook about women and DDR. So, welcome, Florentine, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Florentine. Welcome.
So, Florentine, before asking you about women, I want to ask you about this If the Dare project. What is it?
So it has unfortunately a very difficult German name, which is Internationale Forschungsstelle DDR, International Research Center GDR. And that is actually our approach to the topic, because here within Germany, there is a very, let's say, there's lots of money and lots of media involved to negate the experiences of the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, to make sure, well, that there isn't an alternative and that it wasn't functioning. So our aim is kind of to look at it from a different angle. And we came to it because particularly when you talk with an international and also an internationalist audience, memories of the GDR differ a lot from what we hear here in Germany. The discourse here is very much dominated by Stasi and what we know also from Hollywood movies, etc. But then when you talk to people from South Africa or from Latin America, they remember the GDR quite differently because the GDR supported the national liberation movements, for instance. So it was on the one hand this different memory that made us see the need to promote this more within Germany, but most importantly, the other part of the interest in the GDR is, of course, it was a socialist state. It aimed to construct socialism, and the interest in how this was done in very precise terms is very useful actually today. So, for instance, if we look at how land ownership is still distributed in the world, particularly in post-colonial societies, for example, where land is still owned by white people, well, or in Latin America with the big agro business. So if we talk about ideas of land reform, and we can look to the history of the GDR, because there was a successful land reform happening, and looking at concrete examples, as we are now producing, for example, a study on the land reform, but we also did one, feel free to check it out online, on the health system, to look how did a socialist state build a very different health system to capitalism, one that is free and accessible for all. So the aim is also reflected in the women's study. So together with Tricontinental, we published these studies, and also there was the question: okay, well, what were women's lives like under socialism in more broader sense, but also what were concrete policies to change women's lives? And yeah, this is how we came to publish the dossier, which is really just very shortened extract to give you some concrete examples, even though there's of course lots more.
Of course. Well, thank you, Florentina, because for me, I lived in Berlin for a while, as I told you before, and actually it was a bit disappointing for me to talk with people about the DDR. DDR, because as you told us before, there is just a few ideological association between DDR and no liberty and dictatorship, and people try always to kill you, and I don't know, very and so I'm happy to understand that still there are important a research center as yours that try to be a bit more rational and objective about this point, without saying we have to import or imitate that precise model of society, but there are lots of interesting and good things that we're doing there, and we can always get better also knowing that, no? And particularly about what you were saying, I wanted to ask you, what did legal equality consist of, and which was its cause-effect correlation with the cultural emancipation in the DDR, and if you think that were there any contradictions?
Of course, there were. Like, it's interesting. To reply with Lenin. I just read a speech he gave to women workers, I think in 1917, where he also said, "Yeah, well, right now in the Soviet Union, we're introducing full legal equality, and that's awesome. But of course, that's not enough. And we can only construct socialism when we also work on the real equality." Okay. So I think if we look at the history of the DDR, it's a very peculiar moment, because we have the end of the Second World War, and we have the zones. Germany's partitioned in zones, and in East Germany, the Soviet Union is the occupying power. But so there's a big movement of reconstructing, but also building something new, like which is called like an anti-fascist democratic renewal. And this is so crucial, because on the one hand, in this process, you have, to stick with the example of women, you have anti-fascist democratic women's committees. And first, they have also very, of course, clearly social tasks after the war. But it's also a war on the mind, on renewing the mind, and it's a cultural work to change the mindsets after 12 years of fascism. But also, there's the Soviet Union, where already there is, in terms of women's legal equality, so much progress, and there's an exchange on that. So you really have also a good influence. You also have lots of anti-fascists and communists coming back, for example, from the Soviet Union. And this is where some of the very, let's call them progressive laws, were already introduced by the new organs of so the GDR comes into existence in 1949, but before that, anti-fascists and the Soviet Union rebuilt together. So, for example, to make it concrete, a law like equal pay for equal work was immediately introduced after the war, and this is something. It sets a completely different tone. It's also, even though it's a law, it's a goal you want to reach. It's not that simple, and you see that through the whole history and development of the GDR. So first, you have to get the women into employment to allow them to claim equal pay for equal work, and then you have to create the conditions so they can get equal pay. Because if the women are not qualified for better jobs and have the conditions of pursuing a job, so that they don't have to stay at home because there's no childcare, for example. So it's a step-by-step process, and sometimes it's kind of, it's a circle where there is something like equal pay for equal work, but you have to get there, and this is where the conditions have to be created. They have to be not only created by the state to allow women to get there, but of course it's fought for by the women themselves. And that's, there's some examples in the dossier we can talk about of women's organizing. Yes, I'm wondering if I should come up with more examples, but to reply more generally, we should know there's always a discrepancy between well-meant laws and the reality. But if we look at the GDR, it's the big difference is that there were completely new social and economic conditions created on the basis of which you could fundamentally change, even though in a long, hard process, the position of women, because land and like the new property relations, there was no private property anymore, and this causes like a big difference on
Of course.
Yes, in fact, we wanted to come to work, of course. We're talking about a socialist country, so work has a central role in society. Socialism is it's public property of the meaning of productions, and the property is owned by the workers. So when did the women start working in mass in Germany, and especially in the DDR? And was it enough? You kind of asked this question, but I'm more specifically, if we're talking about work, was it enough? Or did they need a specific feminist struggle to get emancipation? And also, we would like to ask you, what was the role of political and syndical organizations in all this process?
Yeah, that's a big question, and it's two questions. So if I forget a part, please remind me. But of course, it's like looking at work. It's sometimes because we all live in, unfortunately, a capitalist society. Our thinking, our view of it is very much shaped by our own reality. If we look at the bigger historical picture, it's a very contradictory process. So capitalism, already in the 18th, 19th century, throws women onto the labor market in a very bloody process. But it also had its progressive element, because that's the moment when women could also start organizing. And the problem is that capitalism, of course, has, especially back then, used women as cheap labor and discarded them if necessary. So it's what's very crucial is that the meaning of work changes in socialist society. So if it's people's property, and then it's produced by the people, and there's a different relation and need and necessity of work, which is for the people's wealth and well-being. But of course, I mean, we also always have to take into mind that we're after the war, we're in the 1950s. So our traditions and morals are very, very strong, and especially if we think about, I don't know, even maybe our parents or grandparents' generations. So it was a difficult, often also a difficult struggle to overcome old views, and to overcome them, it was not possible to just impose them. It's a bit like the example of the law I was just giving. You can't just say, now we have equality, the law says so. No, you of course need the women to also reclaim that. And that's where, especially in the 1950s and 60s, there were lots of those mass initiatives by women to, like, in cooperation or in, I don't know, in coordination with also the newly democratic mass organizations that were emerging to get women out of the very isolating domestic sphere. And the Housewives brigades, which I'm mentioning in the text, they are just one example, but it's one of my really favorite examples, because already the name, has like the whole program encapsulated in it. Housewife being usually, in the house and isolated and on her own, but brigades making it kind of an organizing process, organizing housewives. Yes, and that's where we get into the process of it's not only that the GDR needed labor force, which it also did, but it was actually really a truly democratic process of, also a kind of euphoria, because it was a new beginning in the GDR, and people understood it like that. Yes, maybe you could. And of course, because you asked about in how far was this also a process via the unions, etc., right?
Yeah. The unions, yes. And also political organizations in general. So not only female organizations, but the ones where the guys were in,
Yeah. When I was doing the research for the notebook, I found it really, really interesting to understand the developments of the organizations and women's organizing in the GDR, because right after the war, the anti-fascist democratic women's committees, which I mentioned, they actually form a unified women's mass organization, and they are called the Democratic Federation, Women's Federation of Germany. And they initially have been founded as a Germany-wide, so East and West organization. But they were forbidden in West Germany very soon. And they were actually, they were a political organization. They didn't necessarily understand themselves as let's call it feminist was not a big term back then, but let's say they didn't understand themselves as a feminist organization, but particularly from the beginning on as an anti-fascist democratic organization that would help getting women into organizing, not necessarily via parties, which existed several in the GDR, but organizing for a cause, and that is, of course, women's equality, but via peace, via democracy, via socialism. And in the course of the rising numbers of women who got employed, where the its short form is DFD, I will call it DFD, was very much involved in supporting and like campaigning for women to get employed. They actually got less and less important as a women's organization. Well, because very soon women were working in factories and everywhere, so they started organizing in the unions, and it was a bit of a bumpy process because in the beginning the unions were not very welcoming. Let's say again, that is where we are with the old traditions, the old thinking, and it's really interesting. In 1961, the ruling Socialist Party that was publishing a communique, and they said, okay, this is really not okay. We have kind of legal equality, but we don't see the results properly. And this is because we're not doing a good job. That is, the party functionaries and the trade union functionaries, and it's a really interesting, very harsh and direct critique, and it calls on the whole public to get more active and actually working towards in contrast to legal equality, let's call it social equality. And especially the unions were attacked on this. And soon after, you have more of progress there. And that's also when the women's committees in the factories have been founded as their kind of own institution. Women should, deal with work issues at their place, or also with other stuff in their committees. But only after there was a discussion and a critique of the unions dealing with women, that they became integrated into the union structures. And in the end, in later years of the GDR, and also with the later then upcoming independent women's movement, there was always a harsh criticism on the DFD, the Women's Mass Organization. But I actually think this criticism comes up also a lot now in bourgeois research. But I think it leaves out or it ignores the fact that half of union members of all the union members in the GDR were women, and half of these women were actually in positions, like they were not just members, but they were actively shaping and organized in the unions. So, okay, very short. I think it was a bumpy start, but in the end, actually, the women's organizing was happening via the unions, via the workplace, and this also relates to the importance and the integration of the workplace in socialist society into everyday life. It had a very huge and crucial role of guaranteeing, for example, child care, or you're having, I don't know, a doctor in the factory. It was part of life. So it had more importance when it came to things related to women's work.
Clear. And maybe you have already mentioned it, but did a gender pay gap still exist during the DDR, in fact, or they were actually able to abolish any kind of gender pay gap?
A gender pay gap did still exist, and it has been also not very publicly debated in the GDR. But if we now debate the gender pay gap, then we really have to make sure that we understand the difference from this society to the society back then. I was just mentioning what your work or your workplace offered you in the GDR. It's mainly participation through organizing. It's social security, in a not by paying taxes somewhere, but in a very, very practical sense. As the examples with childcare, or that your company would have a holiday place where its workers could go to. Very, very concrete examples that affected the people's lives very directly. And at the same time, so let's be clear, I for the study I researched it, I mean, there's a gender pay gap of approximately 16%, depending on the variables. But then next step, we should look at what were wages in the GDR. So your rent in the GDR wasn't allowed to be more than 5% of your wage. Starting point. And then, of course,
5%. I didn't know that.
Oh my God.
And prices in the GDR were fixed, and they were fixed on the level of, I think, even 1936. And it's a discussion we have to do another time, like the economic, how smart that was economically. It also caused problems. But I just want to share this to understand the context. You had also, I don't know, subventions. I don't know the English term,
yes.
But that the state came up for certain things. So it's hard to say that wages are the same. We need them for as today, and also now to the actual problems. It's what I already mentioned. So 40 years the GDR existed. It's a really short time. It's a very short time to overcome old ways of thinking, old morals. If you have a old generation, for example, it's also hard to overcome, like, I mean, women were kept in low skilled or no work for centuries. And it was hard to catch up. The GDR tried very hard. I have the example of the women's advancement plans in the factories. So where an enterprise would, for their yearly plan, say, okay, so we want to produce that and this amount, blah blah blah, and we, I don't know, want to do a cultural night, and we have, I don't know, 5. We want that 5 women get into qualifications training and become, I don't know, like more high. And that's, they sat down, they make concrete plans how to advance, and it's super hard. So you don't see that much of that in the notebook, but I've been very much informed by interviews and conversations and writings of GDR women themselves. And I'm particularly, I was interested in what was published during the GDR. And it doesn't matter, even there's lots of interviews being published even after the end of the GDR. And when you hear those women talk, of course, it's not a rosy paradise, but it's work was an essential part of their Selbstbestimmung.
Of the self-consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. And so they also, which I found so interesting, some of the women said, wow, okay, I actually I have a job and now I have a kid and I can take a year off with my kid, but I'm also, they really asked me to become the, I don't know, the head of the department. And there's always a lot of women, they are also hesitant and they worry that they might not manage, which also shows some of the thinking that is still there, but also that it's, even if some of the women, let's call them the pioneers, who were thrown into managerial, I mean just higher positions, who were like, oh my God, I'm the first woman doing this. I don't know how, but we have to, because we want to, I don't know, construct socialism or yeah. And it's, yeah, it is contradictory. But I feel like even if someone doesn't like the GDR, at least look at the concrete context, at the conditions, and try not assuming something, but for example, reading and of women's lives in the GDR, and yeah, just understanding the context.
Of course.
Yeah. You previously mentioned the Housewives brigades, and actually we wanted to ask you about them. So tell us all about them, please.
Yeah. Well, the Housewives brigades, it's actually an initiative that came up still in the relatively early years of the GDR, because it was that time that I was mentioning of the very euphoric reconstruction mood, and everyone is now, every member of society, women and men, young people, tasked with being a part of building up that society. And the Housewives brigades go back to actually like women in the countryside, where it was already like a normal praxis to help during the harvest, for example. During the harvest, I don't know, women from the other village or even from the city would come and help out. And that's when there were women taking this up in a more broader sense, also in cities. Okay, there are so many women who are, like, they call housewives, who are at home. Not all of them that they just don't want to work, but maybe they have young kids, they wanted to stay home. Yeah, and together, like, this was a process. It was a women's initiative, but it was then also brought into or taken up by the women's mass organization, and it kind of spread. And it's how the Housewives brigades worked was that there was a dire need of workforce in the whole GDR, particularly after the war, and then they would be kind of flexibly employed. So they would, for example, go to a factory. Let's say it's 10 women. These 10 women have 10 kids, so only 9 women go to the factory. 1 woman takes care of the kids, and then work for an hourly wage. But it was not, I think that's crucial. The idea was not only to remain like that, to be a flexible, cheap labor force, but it was actually also a tool, an agitation tool, to win more women over and to convince them of the importance of going into the production sphere. That this is so crucial, because only there they could also organize around their needs. So if women stay at home with the kids, then there's no need for daycare. But if women go into the factory, then the state has to guarantee that there will be childcare. And this is also where we are again with the laws and the reality. Very interesting. The Women's Mass Organization, the DFD, in 1950, they were very much involved in introducing a new law on mother and child protection. And in that law, for example, the state was had to commit to build like daycare centers and kindergartens, etc. And it also made the enterprises commit to guarantee that women workers will have that. So it's again this circle where it's an individual request. It's an organizational mass demand, which is also met with the aim of the state to actually provide that. Yes, and to come back to the Housewives brigades, they really gained momentum. And now I don't have the numbers here right now. I'm sorry, but I think it's interesting that they are losing importance at the very moment that they are so successful, because more and more women are in employment. I think in the 1960s, it's already 70%. And at the end of the 80s, we're at 93% of all women are in work. And that's massive.
Frau?
Yeah, so they were like a starter point.
Yeah. So yeah, let's talk about the care work, because I just want to ask you how the DDR institution support women in the care work, and especially in the child care, because I was really impressed by the fact that both women and men had the right to 12 months parental leave. That is something that doesn't exist even in most of our countries in Europe. In Italy, it doesn't exist. It's something like for men is something like 4 weeks. I'm not kidding. So that was impressive, in my opinion.
Yes. So I think, I was already mentioning how, if the state wants and women want to work, it doesn't work without providing care. And the GDR set up a comprehensive care system, which was particularly in comparison to West Germany at that time, it's really striking how important that is. And though the problems of the amount of domestic work also remained in the GDR, and often there's a criticism on, well, the GDR also didn't manage to, for example, socialize housework. I think people don't consider enough how actually the socialization of care work was successful. So by the 1980s, every kid that wanted to, or whose parents wanted to, could get a kindergarten place. There was full kindergarten coverage of facilities. I don't know how that is in Italy, at least in Berlin, but also in other parts of Germany. It can be hard to get a kindergarten place, or you have to go somewhere very far, and so on. And the same, the GDR also had a put an emphasis on like creche and like little tiny children's. Yeah, exactly. And also reached a level of providing that for, I don't know, 80% of all 0 to 3-year-olds. I mean, next thing to look at would be the school system itself, which was, also like in Germany today, they discuss again that wasn't actually some of the approaches to the school system of like whole day school and wasn't that good. And we see those ideas still in Finland, who regularly win in the PISA studies and so on. So you have a very comprehensive approach to care, which also affects healthcare, because if you go through life, healthcare is particularly interesting if you look at reproductive rights and how a woman was accompanied through her life and with a kid. Yeah, I think it's uncomparable to what we probably see in any European country at this point.
Yeah, and I want to move forward further, because you mentioned the domestic work, and in your notebook you say that there was a debate inside the DDR on how to improve this domestic work. What was this debate?
Yeah, I again for the notebook I take some examples, but of course to show a more general thing, and I took the example of one debate that reflects the GDR's approach to domestic work in general. And of course in the GDR, the GDR was standing in the tradition of the proletarians movement, women's movement, and also in the tradition of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and so the idea of the complete socialization of housework. There were those ideas. Think of Engels, and everything will be socialized. So the woman won't wash her stuff in the washing machine, but everything will be industrialized. Big machines washing everything for everyone. And it's interesting, because now in the GDR, or in the socialist state, you have created the conditions where this should be possible. But it's actually not that easy. And this is kind of the debate I'm mentioning in the notebook. So to have the one side of being, okay, we need full socialization and industrialization of domestic work. But then the other side, that it's more of the, let's say, realistic or pragmatic approach. Okay, under the conditions at this moment, we are actually not either able or it's not smart at this point. And that's the discussion and the tension we have. So I wasn't able to actually mention some of the examples of socialization of housework in the notebook. That's why I will now take my chance here to do it. And washing is actually a very good example, because it took some time until the GDR had developed their washing machines like we have them today. You know, you press a button and then it does everything. That took a while, and washing was one of the most strenuous and heaviest work to like domestic works to do on a regular basis. And there was actually an infrastructure set up with big industrial washing centers throughout the GDR. But in the end, it turned out it wasn't as practical, because in the bigger cities, it wasn't useful, because you had even though you tried to have washing centers everywhere, you don't have a washing center at every corner, because it was really like big industrial washing sites. So it wasn't practical on a daily basis, because you had the way to walk there and so on. And on the countryside, in contrast, it was also not useful, because if you have a washing center in one village, well, do you walk there from the other one? So there were they tried to industrialize certain domestic tasks, but it didn't came up as very useful. And the other example I'm giving of the pragmatic approach is that it's also connected to the 60s, 70s, where there were new technical developments, and that the approach of the automatization of the housework, you know, with new machines and so on, would for now help women more in their daily lives. And also, when this kind of this approach was pursued, it's interesting to also see that from the 1970s on, in media and so on, representation, you have not the woman doing only the housework, but you have a family, the men also cleaning. You know, there was an emphasis put on it. It doesn't mean that this all worked out. Like in the data that in the end was compiled, you still, of course, have that women did most of the housework. But yeah, again, I think comparing it, for example, to West Germany at the time, where women until the 1970s were facing no state comprehensive state childcare structures, where men could still say, no, you don't work there, because he had the right to deny I don't know, a woman's work contract, whatever. It's insane.
Clear. To conclude, Florentine, Florentina, it's more a curiosity, because I wanted to know your opinion about the DDR museum in Berlin, because I was there a few times, also with my parents when they came visiting me, and I don't know. I wanted to know if your opinion is the classic capitalistic and ideological perspective on the DDR. Or if it's well made and it gives different perspectives. And that's the first. The second is that we had this conversation and interview like yours with Wolfgang Streeck. Wolfgang Streeck, I don't know if you know him. He's a German sociologist. He's in the Max Planck Institute of Köln, Wolfgang Streeck. And and he's also a kind of a supporter of the Sarah Wagenknecht party. Also, we had this interview with Fabio De Masi, who's the number 2 of Sarah Wagenknecht. And so I wanted to know your opinion about this political party, because in some way, if you think it could be an alternative both from the actual neoliberalist regime, but also to the FD and diciamo, yes, rational rights.
So I think it's not the worst to go to the DDR museum. But it's also interesting because why is that so? Well, the DDR museum, it's not a state museum. It's not funded. It's privately owned. So someone makes the DDR museum, and at least it offers. Well, at first, I mean, you enter a GDR living room and so on. So it offers an insight into what everyday life, and I think that's all fine. And in the context of German discourse, it's also valuable. Like I would send my tourist friends to the DDR museum. But of course, the DDR museum's aim is not to take the lessons of constructing socialism for our current analysis and causes. So it has its limits, I would say. But I mean, did you enjoy it?
I mean, it's always full of tourists, so it's difficult to enjoy because it's difficult to move. But as you were saying, I enjoyed the part where you can see an actual house of the typical house. So that's part I was enjoying. Then, of course, there was the big part on the wall, because that's the main thing that you have to have in your mind about the DDR is, of course, the wall. But I mean, so I don't know. I just looked at it as a tourist, so I didn't actually have an intellectual idea of it. So that's why I was asking you.
Okay.
I did.
Do you want to? Yeah.
No, I was curious about the Sarah Wagenknecht.
I immediately have to say that so far I haven't looked at. I don't know what they say on women's rights and women's issue. So I can't give a proper analysis or evaluation of that. But maybe if we look a bit at what is left from what was gained in the GDR in terms of women's achievements, I mentioned a few examples that where you still have like a certain continuity, so that actually, if we talk about gender pay gaps, which are at 23-22% in Germany, and even if you look at East and West, they get even higher. But then that because women were actually on a very broad basis in work and trained and so on, that the gender pay gap within East Germany is less high than in West Germany between men and women. Because women were working. Or even that the infrastructure of care, even though it's hard and not enough today for nowadays needs, women in East Germany still send their kids way more often into kindergarten and go working, in contrast to West Germany. And I think just from my own history of organizing around women's or feminist issues, I was always so struck by the sheer ignorance of the achievements of the GDR. I don't know how. I'd be very interested in Italy, but in Germany right now, they are discussing whether we should finally get rid of the abortion paragraph that's still from the times of the 19th century, and well, it's crazy. So in Germany, it's in the criminal code. It's actually a crime, but under certain conditions, it won't get persecuted. Well, in the GDR in 1972, this was abolished, so abortion was legalized. But when GDR ends and so-called unification, which was meaning actually the imposition of the West Germany's legal system and economic system, all these social and women's rights were scrapped, and we're back in the 19th century. And yeah, I found that because of like Francesca introduced this conversation, what we understand of feminism. If you open a history of feminism of Germany, well, they will tell you the history of the West German feminist movement, because they don't perceive and understand East Germany as a feminist movement. And it's also correct in a certain way, but we can't just ignore that history.
Of course.
They don't understand it, or maybe they understand it and they want to erase it. Maybe. So, Florentine, we kidnapped you for almost an hour, and I'm asking you the permission of kidnap you again in the future to talk about DDR. Not only about women, but also about everything else, because it's very fascinating, and I think it's important to talk about socialist experiences of the past, to see the differences and see that maybe they were not that bad as they want to tell us. And so thank you for staying with us. And I also want to thank all the people that followed us until here. And I want to remember you to support our channels, both the Italian and the English one, and to support our social pages. And see you next time. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you very much, Florentina.
Bye.
Thank
you.
you.